I mentioned that the code and the action would be very simple. Let's just take a look at it. It's going to look like this. We're going to log the user in and then redirect to the user's profile page. Or we can do redirect to user. By the way, you might remember that in the user's controller, we did something similar here. But here we've got an @user, and the reason for @user is because we needed the user on the form. So we needed an instance variable. But here we're not actually going to render a form associated with this user. So the general rule is that if you don't need an instance variable, you should just use a regular local variable like this. And so this is the full implementation, but of course the problem is that login is not defined. So that's the task of this next section, is to figure out how to log a user in. Rails comes with a special method for creating sessions, so let's do this here. Let's look at the sessions helper again. And let's define a method called login, corresponding to this right here. And the login method will take in a user object, and then the way to create this session is to use this special method called session. So what we're going to do is we're going to treat this special thing, this session method, like a hash, and we're going to give it a key of the user's ID and a value equal to the ID. Now, this is not the sort of thing you would ordinarily want to expose to the outside world. In our case, the IDs are actually exposed in the URLs, but potentially this could be something that's secret, or maybe we decide we don't want to tell everyone in the world how many users have registered for our site till we switch over to some more obscure ID. We would not want to put this in the session necessarily. So the way that sessions work is that this method here puts a cookie on the browser. Now the terminology gets a little complicated here because there's also a Rails method called cookies. So this session helper creates a special kind of cookie. It's what I'm going to call a temporary cookie, whereas the cookies method will create permanent cookies, or potentially permanent cookies, which I'll sometimes refer to as persistent cookies. Now because of the way session works, it actually encrypts this user ID, and so that problem I mentioned before will not occur. This user ID will not appear in the browser in any form that can be read. So what this does is places a temporary encrypted cookie with the user's ID on the browser, and then on the next page, it decrypts that ID, and we're going to use it to retrieve the user from the database. That may sound complicated, but it all happens automatically by virtue of this session method. By the way, you might notice this is just one line, so we in principle could have just put that right here. But I like the idea of having some sort of abstraction layer, because you never know, this might get more complicated over time. Or we might end up reusing this method, and in fact that will happen later in this lesson. This is actually working now. Let's take a look at our browser here. Log in. Oops, that's right. And I clicked that link. We're going to fill that in. But for now, we have to actually type it in. And now let's log in. Click here. So it actually worked. It redirected. But of course, there's not actually any indication that we're logged in. And if we go here, it's the same home page. The login link is still here, but which we wouldn't normally expect if we're logged in. But we can actually look at the cookies. Click here on Content Settings, and then look at all cookies and site data. And you can see here we've got 2 cookies. Let's take a look at this. We've got the sample app session. And this is the encrypted version of the cookie. So what we did is we put this in here. Right, session of user ID is user.id. This here is the encrypted version of that. So this is the session that's been created by session of user ID. We'll have to be more careful with the cookies helper because that does not encrypt the cookies. But the session method is safe and uses a very strong encryption scheme to encrypt the information.